In episode 6, Joe dives into Reese Montrose, trying to find out all he can to exploit any cracks that he might find. Unfortunately, though, he doesn't find any. He also hates the fact that because of Reese, he had to push Kate away. Kate has an event coming up at Sundry House, but she didn't invite Joe. Joe would have absolutely gotten an email had he not pushed her away. He actually overhears about the event when he opens up his door, and he overhears Kate and Roald discussing it. Roald won't be able to make the event because he's going away for a little bit. Lucky for Joe, though, he does end up getting an invite from Lady Phoebe. Lady Phoebe is planning on being in attendance, but she's going through a really difficult time. She has a little bit of PTSD from the Hampsey fire, but more importantly, she thinks she's being followed. She tells Adam this because the two had gotten back together, but Adam figures that it's just nothing more than her fans. Phoebe, though, is way more concerned. Adam tries to set her mind at ease and tells her to get ready for the party and have fun. Before Joe can head off to this party, he dives even more into researching Reese. He knows he has to find some way to get to him. The problem is he always has somebody around him. He's either in public, has security. It's really, really difficult. As he's doing a little bit of research in the school library, Nadia comes up and interrupts him a little bit. She notices that Joe is listening to Reese's podcast, and she mentions how one of her friends had seen him doing a jog around a park one morning. That could be the opening that Joe needs. He heads home from the library and wants to dive more into attacking Reese at the park, much like he attacked Peach. But when he gets home, he's not alone because Reese has broken in. He's sitting there waiting for Joe. Joe is very taken aback, but he does get some information on why Reese killed who he killed. He killed Malcolm because he was blackmailing Reese regarding his gambling habit. Simon's exploitation of women was about to leak, and he would have been associated with it. Gemma was a drunken mistake that he made while he was married, and it was only a matter of time before she opened her big mouth. They all had to go. But now he needs the Eat the Rich story to go away. It's not good for his campaign. He didn't come here to chit-chat with Joe. He came here to give him an ultimatum. You have to go find somebody to pin this on. And if you don't, it's all going to be pinned on you. This gives Joe a whole lot to think about when he heads to Sundry House. He walks in, he sees Kate, but she ignores him. First person he actually talks to is Phoebe. She confides in Joe that she feels like she's being stalked. Joe uses this to his advantage, trying to find out from Phoebe which one of her friends would be more likely to be a killer so he can tag them with the murders. The person he comes up with is Connie. Phoebe tells Joe that Connie is already a suspect in the murders because he didn't have an alibi. While Phoebe doesn't think that Connie could have actually done it, for Joe and Reese, it doesn't matter. He's a mark. As he's talking to Phoebe, though, he looks to his right and he sees Kate with another guy, very handsy, very friendly. The guy's name is Nico. He's a bachelor and the heir to a shipping fortune. Phoebe has no idea what he's doing in London, and Joe doesn't care. What he does care about is he's really friendly with Kate, and it's pretty clear that the two do have a past. Joe tries to remind himself that Kate is a free woman, but it still irks the hell out of him. What Joe doesn't know is Nico is there to catch up with Kate. He tells Kate that he no longer works for his dad. Since he knows that she doesn't use the Lockwood name, he felt like there would be a connection. He's able to schmooze this connection into a private showing for Simon's art later that night. He'll be able to see the exhibit before anybody else. He'll also be able to purchase the art before anybody else, which is a pretty big deal. That night, Nico and Kate meet up, and Nico makes a substantial offer for all of the art before the exhibit even opens. The next day is the day of the actual exhibit opening, though. Before Joe goes, he meets with Connie. He was honestly surprised that Connie agreed to meet with him. But the more he talks to Connie, the more he feels bad for him. Connie shows up with a broken nose, looking like a dog who got in the trash. He knows that he's messed up time and time again. He knows that the cops are after him because he doesn't have an alibi. He also knows that he isn't capable of doing those things. The way that Joe can justify this to himself is that if he does frame Connie for murder, Connie will be forced to get clean. Maybe change his life for the better. As he's looking at Connie in such a sad state, he gets a text message from Reese telling him to go back to his house, look in the freezer once he finds someone to pin this on. When Joe eventually does go home and look in the freezer, it's Simon's ear, sitting there waiting. That will be the item that they'll use to pin the murders on whoever. Reese also tells him that he has to do it tonight or the murders are on him. So that night, Joe is planning on pinning the murders on Connie. He knows that Connie will be at the art exhibit, so that's where he heads. With the ear securely in his pocket, he starts looking around for Connie. But the person who grabs his ear first is Adam. Adam apologizes for everything that went down in Hampstead, but he also needs something from Joe. Adam is planning on proposing to Phoebe, and he needs a good word. He knows that Phoebe values Joe's opinion, so he says to him, "Hey, when you see her, can you just put in a good word?" The thing that Joe and Phoebe don't know is Adam isn't doing this because of love. He was trying to sell his car collection to a buyer, and the buyer knew how cash-strapped that Adam was. He also knew who he was dating and knew that there was an out. He knew that if Adam married Phoebe, his financial woes are gone. So he gave him an option. He told Adam, "I'll give you a diamond ring to propose with, and if she says yes, then great. But if she doesn't, I get all of your cars for free." Adam, by the way, is planning on proposing the next day. As soon as Adam leaves Joe's company, Joe sees two familiar faces that he wasn't expecting to see today: Nadia and Edward, the two kids that hated each other in class. Edward's mom got them an invite. She wanted him to be more cultured, and Nadia realized that he wasn't all that bad. They both, though, do the "what are you doing here?" because Nadia knows that Joe isn't rich. She is completely floored, though, when he mentions how he has friends there, and one of those friends is Phoebe. Nadia is starstruck when she sees her. Joe tells her to walk over, grab a selfie, but he wants to get out of the conversation because he wants to find Connie. He turns the corner, though, and he doesn't find Connie. He runs into Kate. They're face to face. They're kind of forced to talk. And Joe starts complimenting Kate on the event. And Kate says, "You do realize you're giving mixed signals right now. You say you don't want to pursue anything, and then you come to my event." She tells him that he has to figure out what he actually wants, and then she walks away. That is when Joe sees Connie. He looks like he's passed out in the corner already. Joe feels like this is perfect. He's just sneak over, put the ear in his pocket, and done. But when he tries to, Connie wakes up. He's actually excited to see Joe because he's excited to tell him that he checked himself into rehab. He can't wait to start his new life, the clean and sober life. Even after this, Joe considers pinning the murders on Connie, but he can't bring himself to do it. He walks away from Connie and hears everybody clapping. He asks Blessing what's going on, and she tells him that Nico bought all of the art, which is a huge donation to Kate's foundation. As Joe is trying to eavesdrop on Kate and Nico's conversation, Nadia runs up and asks, "Hey, is everything okay? I just asked Lady Phoebe for a selfie and she was dragged out by some really rude waitress. Apparently the police need to speak to her." This is the first that Joe is hearing about this, and he starts to panic a little bit. The police are there, but when he gets the group together and asks the police for some details, they have no idea what Joe or Nadia are talking about. They do a quick radio call, and nobody from the police department escorted Lady Phoebe out. All hope isn't lost. They know she couldn't have gotten far. They took an elevator downstairs. Sundry House has a bunch of hotel rooms in it, so they're probably in one of those. But Lady Phoebe is in danger. The woman who escorted her down told her that the police needed to speak to her privately alone, but this woman is a stalker. She had posed before as a photographer, but she is a super fan of Phoebe. She felt like with the police not doing their job catching the Eat the Rich killer, she had to take matters into her own hands and protect her sister. At least that's what she calls Phoebe. They're not related. After what Phoebe told Joe earlier in the day, he figures that this might be related. Because of Joe's background in this sort of thing, he's able to locate Phoebe pretty quickly. While the woman had locked the door, both Phoebe and Joe convince her to open it, and that's when they're able to overpower her. It's actually Phoebe who takes the knife away from her and yells at her. A few seconds after Phoebe does take the knife away, the cops come down, and they happen to find the ear that Joe planted on the woman. Now they have their mark for the Eat the Rich killer. Adam comes running down to make sure that Phoebe's okay, but this kidnapping wasn't a total loss. The woman told Phoebe that Adam was using her. He was completely broke, and that's why the staff was walking out. So Phoebe now feels like she's been lied to by her boyfriend. Because of that, Adam's the last person she really wants to see. With the police escorting the woman out, Phoebe looks at Joe and says, "You're the hero, again." And Nadia overhears that. Because curiosity got the best of her, she followed everybody downstairs, and she finds that comment really interesting. She starts to think that there's something off with Joe, like he knows more than he's letting on. And she's definitely going to keep her eye on him. The next day, right after his girlfriend was kidnapped, Adam decides this will be a great day to propose. But she said no. After finding out about all his financial troubles, she wants him to get his affairs in order before he makes such a commitment. While that relationship is on the rocks, there's another relationship that seems to be blooming. Joe looks over and sees Kate and Nico about to hook up in Kate's apartment, but then they stop. And Joe can sense that they're fighting. They're fighting because as Kate was starting to hook up with Nico, she looked down and saw that Nico got a text message from her father. She realizes that Nico is now working for her dad. She feels completely betrayed by Nico. She no longer wants to sell him any of the art. And while Nico pleads his case, she kicks him out. That's the opening that Joe needed. He waits a little bit of time and then heads over to Kate's apartment. It takes a whole lot of words, but he basically tells her, "I want you." And the two end up hooking up that night. When he gets back to his apartment, sex hair and all, he is pissed. Not because of the sex, that was cool, but because Reese Montrose is sitting in his apartment with a crap-eating grin on his face. The frustration level for Joe is reaching a boiling point. He sits down and says, "Okay, Reese, what now? This is over, right?" And Reese laughs and says, "Over? I mean, we're done dealing with the little people, if that's what you mean." There is one last thing. You'll love it. It's Kate's father. We're going to have so much fun killing him. Episode 7 picks up right where Episode 6 left off. Joe has no interest in killing Kate's father, even though Kate absolutely hates the guy. He tells Reese, "I'm done." Reese reminds Joe that Joe's actions are the whole reason why Reese has leverage. So Joe has nobody to blame but himself. He sits down next to Joe and starts pitching him on why Tom Lockwood needs to die. Joe asks Reese, "What does Tom have on you?" And Reese lies and says, "I have nothing to hide." The problem that Joe has is he knows Tom Lockwood is untouchable. A clearly frustrated Joe is at his wit's end. And Reese says, "Look, I'll make you this promise. Kill Tom Lockwood, and it's the last thing I'll ever ask of you to do." Joe tells Reese that he'll do it, but in reality, he just wants to find out what Tom Lockwood has on Reese so he can take Reese down. In order to do that, he has to get in with Kate. He starts going on dates with her. They're getting along great. And Joe finally gets his opportunity when they're walking around and she mentions how her dad is coming into town and she's planning on leaving to avoid him. And Joe says, "No, let's go out with him. I'll be there to support you." To Kate, it seems like Joe is just being a really caring boyfriend. But in reality, getting close to Kate means getting close to Tom, which means finding out the real reason why Reese wants him dead. After Kate agrees, Joe goes into his office and starts Googling Tom Lockwood, trying to find out as much as he can about the guy. It's not great. Tom Lockwood's done a really good job of scraping the internet of any bad things he's done, replacing them with all the philanthropic things he's done. As he's doing this research, Nadia walks in. Nadia is super suspicious about Joe to this point. She doesn't really buy the fact that that woman was the Eat the Rich killer. She's not jumping to that conclusion just yet. And she wants to find out more about Joe. So she's using any excuse she can to go visit him, talk to him. And in this instance, she uses her short story that she wrote, asking Joe if he's had a chance to take a look at it. And Joe says, "No, I'm sorry. I actually been really distracted." She uses her story as an excuse to start questioning Joe. She asks him if he has any idea why this woman killed Malcolm. She wants to, quote, use it in her story. And Joe sees right through it. So to shut her down, he just tells her, "Look, your story was convoluted and confusing. That's why I couldn't get through it. I didn't want to tell you, but I'm sorry I had to be direct." Right before she leaves, she asks a question that only somebody that actually read the first 15 pages would have known. Joe answers it very matter of fact, but from Nadia's expression, you get the sense that she made it all up to catch Joe in a lie. Either way, Joe has no idea about it, doesn't really think much of it, because that night he has his dinner with Kate and Tom. Kate is really nervous, and Tom seems like a very doting father. But when she introduces Joe as Jonathan, her dad gets up close, introduces himself, and then whispers in Joe's ear, "Hey, Joe." That is something that Joe was not expecting. He then has to sit down with these two and act like nothing happened. While Tom and Kate are getting acquainted, Joe starts going through his head about what else he knows. Does he have any idea what happened in Madre Linda? Does he have any idea what happened to Beck? The more that Joe watches the interaction between father and daughter, the more he realizes that Tom actually does come off as pretty likable. Especially when he retells a story about Kate calling all of his contacts to adopt puppies. Even Kate seems to be kind of charmed by her dad. Later on in the dinner, Tom gets to the reason of why he wanted to meet with Kate. He has a waiter wheel out a model of a museum, the Lockwood Museum. He's collected all this art. It's just sitting in a building, and he wants to give it to Kate to populate a museum, which is her dream. He's already got everything in place. This thing's going to be in downtown Manhattan, prime real estate. He's willing to pay for all of it. Kate is hesitant, though. She feels like her dad has ulterior motives, and Tom says, look, I'm not asking you to say yes right away. Just think about it. This is your dream. She's so flustered by this that she gets up and excuses herself to go to the bathroom. And now it's just Joe and Tom, and they're able to chat. Tom gets right into it, asking Joe, did you kill Love Quinn? A question that Joe says no to. Tom then asks him, have you ever killed anyone? And that's when Joe starts to deflect. He tells Tom, I know you're worried about Kate. I would be too. But I'm a quiet guy. I only want a quiet academic life. Tom seems to believe the story and tells him, just don't hurt Kate or you'll meet the real me. He surprises Joe, though, because he asks about Reese, and this is just what Joe was looking for. He tells Joe that he's a threat to his interests. He knows that the memoir that Reese wrote is fabricated, and he also knows that the press is about to run a story on it. But he wants to know if Joe can tell him any more information that might benefit him. Joe stays quiet, and Tom says, if you can bring me something substantial, I'll protect you. And it's at this moment that Joe realizes that he's going to use Tom to put Reese in prison. When the night wraps up, Joe and Kate head home, but Kate has to tend to Phoebe. Phoebe has PTSD from everything that happened, and Kate needs to be there to just be a good friend. Kate really thinks that Phoebe needs to see a therapist and a mental health professional to help her out, but what Phoebe's really concerned with is the press finding out any of this. The great Lady Phoebe struggling. Kate assures her that getting away and getting some rest is the move, and she's willing to go with her just so that Phoebe's comfortable. A little while later, Kate is setting up their mini getaway when she gets a knock at the door, and it's Adam, looking absolutely horrible. After Phoebe turned him down, he lost everything. His club, his cars, but he realized that the thing he misses most is her. So he came hat in hand trying to win her back. Kate tells him that she's planning on taking him into a hospital, but he's able to convince Kate, and Phoebe for that matter, that he should be the one to drive her there. Kate reluctantly agrees. While Adam and Phoebe are leaving, right down the hall, Joe is trying to get his plan together to catch Reese in lies. He sets up a camera, he starts recording on his phone, and he sends a text to Reese that says, I can see why you want Lockwood dead, given what he has on you. And that's just enough to get Reese to show up a little while later. Maybe a minute after Reese enters Joe's apartment, he knows that Joe was lying. He also can sense that Joe is recording, and when he checks Joe's phone, he sees that he actually is. He gets infuriated. So he once again shows Joe that he is smarter than him. He pulls out Marianne's passport. Joe can't figure out how Reese even found Marianne. But at this point, it doesn't matter. Reese gives him the ultimatum that if Lockwood isn't dead in 24 hours, Marianne dies. But if Lockwood is dead, then he'll let her live and go back to her daughter. The next day when Joe wakes up, he's getting texts from Reese saying that the clock is ticking, but he can sense a different kind of tone in these text messages. And then when he hops on Google, he finds out why. Because that story broke about Reese's memoir being partially made up. In response, Reese has fled to the countryside. Because the clock is ticking, Joe, unfortunately, is running out of time. He's not going to be able to find Marianne in enough time, and he knows that he's going to have to kill Tom. As he's sitting and realizing what a crappy situation he's in, he gets a knock at the door, and it's Kate. Something really has been bothering Kate. It's the fact that she wasn't honest with Joe, so she's coming clean to him now. All that stuff that she said about her dad and the cancer and covering it up, that wasn't Tom. That was actually Kate, trying to be Tom. Tom had always put so much pressure on his daughter to be just like him and be successful like him that she started to. But finally, it just ate at her. She realized what a terrible person she was becoming, so she went the other way. And this really did a number on Kate. She tells Joe, I'm not scared of being my dad because I'm already worse. I mean, Kate really beats herself up about what she did. She feels really remorseful. Joe listens. He tells her that it's going to be okay, that her past doesn't define her, and he genuinely makes her feel better about coming clean. When she leaves, however, he knows he has to choose between Tom and Marianne, and he chooses Marianne. He sets up a meeting with Tom in his office back at school. Tom comes with security, but he tells the security guard to go back to the car. so that him and Joe can talk alone. It's just what Joe wants. He entices Tom with a first edition book on Winston Churchill so that he can look it over, and as Tom is doing so, Joe's about to stab him in the back. But Tom turns around. He can see in Joe's eyes that something isn't right, and he says, "I can see that you're scared to tell me the truth about Reese, but it's okay." He then segues the conversation, though, to Love Quinn, saying, "I think you did it. And it's okay, she seemed like a maniac, but still, I think you did it. When push came to shove, you can kill. And maybe the most important part is you can do it well enough to get off scot-free. The good news is, Joe, I know where Reese is. I also know that he's all alone and unprotected. So I want you to go there and kill him. And honestly, the alternatives aren't great. You're dating my daughter, living with some assumed name. I could take all of that away." He writes down the address of where Joe can find Reese, and then he heads out. While this is good news for Joe, his girlfriend, Kate, gets some bad news. She's called Phoebe a few times to make sure that she got to the hospital, but she hasn't heard back. She's starting to get pretty concerned, and that's when Phoebe and Adam walk through the door. They're engaged. Kate, though, isn't happy for him. She yells at Adam, "You had one job to do. Get her help." She tries to tell Phoebe that she's not thinking straight, but both Adam and Phoebe don't really want to hear it. They're too love-struck, and Kate can't get through. Normally, Kate would complain to Joe about such a situation, but Joe had already headed out to the country to meet with Reese. When he gets there, it's just as Tom said it would be. Reese, alone. He knocks on the door, and he's surprised because Reese acts like he doesn't know Joe. But Joe barges his way in, ties Reese up in a barn, and starts interrogating him. He starts asking Reese, "Where is Marianne?" But Reese continues to claim that he doesn't know. Joe starts torturing him after reading a book on torture, and still, Reese is claiming that he doesn't know where Marianne is, and that he doesn't even know who Joe is. Joe gets so infuriated by this that he starts choking Reese until he can't control himself, and he literally kills him. Joe is really taken aback at what he just did. He didn't think that he was going to take it this far. He also realizes how much of a screw-up this was because now he's never finding Marianne. And that's when he hears a voice behind him say, "Well, isn't this a pickle?" And it's Reese. Right away, Joe thinks that he's hallucinating. This new Reese, though, tells him, "He wasn't lying, Joe. He really didn't know you. But then again, I wasn't lying either. We really do have Marianne in a cage." And it's true. They do have Marianne in a cage. Nadia had someone give her access to Joe's office. She started sneaking around, trying to find out anything she could, and she came across a key. She then got photos from Edward where Joe had this bag of an Indian restaurant, so Nadia headed there, and there was an abandoned building across the way. A curious Nadia entered it, went inside, and used the key to open up a door where there was Marianne. In episode 8, Joe realizes that it was him the entire time. The Reese Montreux that he's grown to know was actually just a figment of his imagination. And he can't believe it. Fake Reese tells him that the actual Reese, the one that's dead in front of him, wasn't lying. He didn't know Joe. Joe assumed that he did because every time he saw him in public, he did recognize him, so he would give him a nod, but they never actually conversed. It was all made up. It all started when Joe kidnapped Marianne. Up until this point, he thought he let her go, but he didn't. He roofied her drink and slipped her off the train, unconscious. He brought her back to his flat where he tied her up and gagged her, trying to convince her to get in a relationship with him. While trying to convince Marianne that Joe was the right person for her, he continued to drug her up. And she knew it. She knew that he was slipping her stuff, but she didn't care. She was thirsty at the time. But he wasn't just obsessed with Marianne. He was obsessed with Reese Montreux. During this time, he was listening to his audiobook, watching YouTube videos, interviews. Everything Reese, he was consuming. He didn't even realize it, but his new infatuation wasn't a woman, it was Reese. All that Marianne was focused on was getting back to her daughter. She knew that she could use Joe's drugging against him. One particular night, Joe thought that he drugged her up, but she actually didn't drink whatever it was that night, so she was fully conscious, just pretending. This night, however, was an unfortunate night, because Joe puts her in a box and wheels her down to where he's keeping that cage. While he's dragging Marianne's body down to the cage, he's listening to Reese's audiobook. All of that, though, is background noise for Marianne, and when she has her chance, she pushes Joe away and tries to escape. But Joe grabs her, pulls her off the steps, and it results in Marianne breaking her arm. Joe gets so mad at Marianne because he feels like she just doesn't understand. They get in a big argument about letting Marianne go to be back with Juliet, and Joe continuously saying, I would never hurt her, until he yells, quiet, I would never hurt her. But then Joe gets weird. He just starts repeating, this isn't me. I'm not that man. When Marianne looked into his eyes, she could tell that he was a different person. His eyes were empty. And then Joe bashes his head against the cage. Maybe it was all the Reese Montrose in the background, but that's when he created this figment of his imagination. Because when he gets up, he flat out looks at Marianne and says, I'm not Joe. Joe had developed a split personality. And that split personality would bring Marianne food every night, but he also brought her pills. Marianne got really worried because she knew that these pills would force her to relapse. She wasn't really quite sure why Joe would do this, but then again, it wasn't Joe that she was dealing with anymore. It was this fake Reese. The real Joe was still convinced that he had let Marianne go. He was a changed man. But he wasn't. After Joe is forced to get rid of the body of the real Reese Montrose, he and the figment of his imagination head to Joe's apartment, where this figment sits him down and explains everything. It's hard to believe for Joe that he was talking to himself when he thought he was talking to Reese. But the hardest part is accepting the fact that he hadn't changed, that he actually did murder those people. Malcolm for insulting Marianne, Simon for taking advantage of young artists, and Gemma was onto him. And it wasn't Reese who killed them, it was Joe, although he doesn't remember any of it. This figment of his imagination represents who Joe really is. Even though Joe wanted to change and he went on this redemption tour, now, deep down, this figment is really who Joe wants to be. A killer. It turns out Roald was right the entire time. Joe was, in fact, the Eat the Rich killer. As he's having a conversation with his inner self about how crazy it is that he locked himself in a burning building, his inner self mentions that Marianne is in a cage, and she hasn't been fed in a long time. The thing is, Joe doesn't remember where Marianne is. The only one who knows where she is Joe's inner self. This fake Reese isn't really keen to help Joe figure this out. Joe also knows that he has to get to class. Appearances are everything, and he needs to appear like everything's going all right. That's really tough to do, though, because the disappearance of the real Reese Montrose has hit national news. Acting normal isn't going to be easy for Joe. While walking to class, he runs into Kate, who is dealing with an issue of her own, although a lot less serious. It's the fact that everybody's been invited to Phoebe and Adam's engagement party. And Kate knows that what Phoebe really needs isn't a party, it's psychiatric care. She's worried about her friend getting legally bounded to a leech. And that's exactly what Adam is. The hardest part for Kate is that Phoebe isn't returning her calls. She has no idea where she is or how to track her down. And Joe, who is half listening to the conversation, says, well, I've never seen Phoebe wear the same outfit twice. Just go to where she shops. She'll probably run into her. It's great advice because when Kate does track Phoebe down, she finds her, and she's surprised because Phoebe says, you've been avoiding me. Kate assures her that that's not the case. She just says, I think my messages got lost. She knows she has to play this thing delicately. She tells Phoebe that she's got a car waiting for her to take her to get that rest that they agreed on. But Phoebe isn't even listening. She tells Kate, I have something to tell you. That engagement party? It's not an engagement party. It's our wedding. Kate gets super concerned for her friend and starts convincing her not to go through with such a rushed wedding, and that's when Adam comes out and ruins everything. His ears really perk up when he overhears Kate mention the word prenup. He then proceeds to gaslight Kate, saying every time you're around, Phoebe's sad, and then they head off, and Kate wasn't really able to do anything she wanted. Joe also headed off to class, where there's one person amazingly missing, and that's Nadia. That's because Nadia found Marianne in that cage. After Marianne explains who she is, why she's there, Joe Goldberg, the entire backstory, Nadia wants to call the police, but Marianne says, no, you can't. It won't matter. He'll always get away with it, and he'll come back for me. Nadia, this guy stalked me halfway across the world. He will find me again. Marianne then explains that because of her daughter, she needs to do this in a way that gets her back to her daughter safely. Nadia vows to come back to Marianne with some kind of plan. And Marianne's advice to her is, do not let him find out that you know about me. Because of the run-in with Marianne, Nadia shows up late for class. But it's obvious to everybody in the room that she's just not as engaged. Joe especially notices and is a little bit concerned, so he has to speak with her after class. He asks, "Are you okay?" And Nadia, thinking fast, blames it on Edward, saying that she's just having boy problems. And Joe believes it. Joe then heads home because he's got to focus on finding out where Marianne is. His inner self is still not being much help. He's pretty much turned his entire apartment upside down and hasn't found a thing. Eventually, though, with the help of this fake Reese, he is able to find the key that's hidden in Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. But he's also able to find the box. He keeps one for everybody he's obsessed with, and Reese is no different. It's got receipts, chewing gum, sweaty gym towel, but it also has a map of Reese's favorite places to go. So he goes around town looking at these places until eventually he reaches the Indian restaurant, where right across the street he sees an abandoned building that would be perfect for keeping somebody hidden. In episode 9, Joe heads down to where he's keeping Marianne, and he is shocked. He can't believe that she is actually there in a cage, because he just doesn't remember any of this. He's so amazed that he's unaware of the fact Nadia is in the corner. Nadia had returned, just like she said she would, and she has a plan, although it's bold. She doesn't get to tell Marianne about this plan because she heard Joe coming and she had to hide. As he starts to apologize to Marianne and reassuring her that he will get her out, his inner self is telling him, "Don't make promises you can't keep." He tries his best to ignore the inner voice, telling Marianne that he's going to fix all of this. And all Marianne wants to do is get the hell out of there. But no matter how much she begs, Joe isn't about to do that. He has to formulate a plan before he lets her out. He also has a wedding to get to. That day is Adam and Phoebe's engagement party, which is really their wedding. He gives her a sketchbook to keep her entertained and says, "I will be back with a plan," and then he heads out. Nadia and Marianne are then able to continue their conversation. They start discussing how they're going to get rid of Joe, and the best idea that Nadia can come up with is inject him with ketamine. She knows that Edward can get her some, and then it's just a matter of injecting it into Joe. She'll also need a drill for the door to let Marianne out, and Marianne says, "Can you also bring me a knife?" Because Marianne wants some kind of security. Joe, meanwhile, didn't head straight to the wedding. He knew that if he was going to let Marianne go, he needs an exit strategy, meaning he needs to get out of town. He starts looking on the internet for signs of people that are hinting at being able to get fake passports, and he contacts one of them. While he's doing this, he's getting texts from Kate saying, "Where are you?" Because she's at the party and it isn't going well. She was able to track down Phoebe, who was banging lines of cocaine like she's Pablo Escobar, and while Kate tried to talk some sense into her by not going through with this, Phoebe didn't want to hear it. She actually snaps at Kate because she is not thinking straight and is hell-bent on marrying Adam, even though Kate knows it's going to be a disaster. So after this blow-up with her best friend, she's frantically texting Joe, "Where are you?" because she needs moral support. But Joe is trying to find an exit plan, but also battling with his inner self again. And that's when his inner self reminds him that there's something deep in his freezer. When Joe goes to it, it's Vic's gun. He completely forgot that he put it there. And Joe's inner self wants him to use that gun to kill Marianne, because that's how he thinks he gets out of this mess, by ending Marianne's life. Joe doesn't want to do that, though. He wants to be a changed person. Joe tells the fake Reese that he's going to go see Kate one last time, free Marianne, and get the hell out of town. That's how he's going to end this thing. And he heads off to the party. Kate can't fake the fact that she's not happy to be there. She shows Joe how bad it is by pulling out pills that she found on the floor, saying Phoebe is so pilled up that she doesn't know what's going on. "I found these, and these are tranquilizers." In a last-ditch effort, she asked Joe to go talk to Phoebe, because whatever Joe said to Phoebe the first time they met really resonated with her. The problem is Joe doesn't remember what he said to her, but he gives it his best shot. As hard as he tries, though, he can't get through to Phoebe in enough time before Adam catches him, and Adam kicks both of them out of the party. A little while later, Adam and Phoebe are wed, but as soon as she says "I do," Phoebe starts rethinking things. Especially when Adam starts talking about business and spending her money. It's at that moment that Phoebe realizes what Kate said was right. This dude is a straight-up leech. And she quietly makes an Irish exit. Nobody notices. Kate and Joe, meanwhile, have nothing left to do but walk home and realize that they failed. Joe is trying to prolong this moment with Kate because he knows it'll be his last. He starts talking about, well, if this is the last time I ever see you, and that's a little bit confusing for her to hear. While it pains Joe, he does have to leave because he has more things to take care of before he leaves town. So he tells Kate, I have to go take care of some things. I will call you. The next day, however, is bad for Kate. It starts out with a phone call that Phoebe was admitted to the hospital. She's really concerned for her friend, and she's leaving her flat, calling the hospitals, trying to figure out where she is when she sees her dad waiting for her. Tom can tell that his daughter's distressed, and Kate quickly fills him in on why she's upset. Everything that happened with Phoebe, and mainly the fact that it's Adam's fault that all of this went down. He then, however, transitions to why he actually showed up. It wasn't just a quick meeting. He wants Kate to take over the company. Right away, she starts questioning what kind of skeletons he's hiding, how many kids are dead. But he looks at her and says, you've got to forgive yourself. You aren't your mistakes. And you've been proving that every day since you left us. You're ready to take over the company. She starts giving the reasons why she doesn't want to take the job, and Tom gets so upset that he starts scrutinizing her life. The fact that she runs a gallery, the fact that she's dating Joe, he just doesn't feel like this life is good enough for her. So he pressures her to accept this deal. And she doesn't say yes, but she agrees at the very least to think about it. She gives him her answer later in the day, though, when she finds out that Adam has been murdered. She knows exactly who was behind it. It was her dad. She approaches Tom in his hangar as he's working on his plane, and he admits, yeah, he had something to do with it. Kate thought that Adam was a problem, so he came up with a solution. It's that simple. And the cavalier nature of this murder is exactly why Kate doesn't want to take over the company. She refuses. She wants to be her own person. But her dad is fed up with treating her with kid gloves and says, you don't even get it, do you? Everything you have is because of me. Everything. Your internships, your galleries, your jobs, your apartment. You think you got it all on your own, but you didn't. I might not have been involved, but I was involved far away. I was the one who was paying for this stuff. I was the one who was giving the recommendations. I was the one who was calling in favors to get you these jobs. So, yeah, I own you. And the realization for Kate that her dad had handed her everything when, up until this point, she thought she had earned everything the right way is really tough for her. She's absolutely speechless. And before he kicks her out, he says, I'll give you a call later this week. We'll set it all up. Because as far as she's taking over his company. Joe, meanwhile, headed to check on Marianne, but his plan isn't perfected yet. He just knows he needs to feed her. She asks him, hey, have you checked on Juliet? And he says, I'll do that now. He goes over to Marianne's phone and starts texting the woman who's watching Juliet, but he's really surprised because the woman immediately texts back, you contact me now? We thought you changed. You're losing custody. Juliet's grandmother's taking her. Don't bother coming back. Joe knows that this is going to absolutely crush Marianne, but he has no choice. He's got to tell her what happened. He tries saying that he's going to fix it, but Marianne loses it, saying, you're not going to fix anything. You did this. Joe, they think that I relapsed. I'm in here, and now I'm never going to see my daughter again. And the truth is, Joe has no idea how he's going to fix it. And while he's trying to think of a way, his inner self is telling him, you know how to fix it. Put her out of her misery. Kill her. Joe still vows to fix this, although he heads home and he starts frantically packing because he knows he has to free Marianne ASAP so she can get back to Juliet and explain herself. But that means that he's got to speed up the process of getting out of town. While he's packing, his inner self keeps arguing with him to the point where Joe gets so sick of it, he swallows one of those tranquilizers that belong to Phoebe, the same ones that he got from Kate, because he just wants to shut up this voice in his head. And boy, does he shut him up. He knocks himself out. And when he wakes up, a whole lot of time has passed. But the good thing is, the fake Reese is gone. And he's got 2 hours to get Marianne out of that cage, onto a train, and back to Juliet. He heads over to the cage and tells Marianne, you're free. But when he puts in the code, it doesn't work. And Joe always uses the same code. As he's trying to figure out what the code is, Marianne starts gasping for air, and she asks Joe, what did you do? She opens up the lid to the coffee that he brought her, and she says, peanut oil. And she starts choking. Joe is punching in code after code, but nothing is working. And he just has to sit there and watch Marianne have an allergic reaction. Suddenly, Joe is no longer in this room with the cage. He's visited by basically the ghosts of his past, like Jacob Marley style. Beck makes an appearance. although she doesn't give him the code. And even Love makes an appearance. And that's a pretty awkward conversation. And then Joe wakes up in his apartment, and the fake Reese is back. Joe walks over to his freezer, grabs the gun, and then turns to the fake Reese and says, I know what to do. You're right. Freeing Marianne and running, that's not going to work. So I'm going to free Marianne, and then I'm going to end this cycle. But this inner self knows that by ending the cycle, it ends him. So he starts trying to pitch Joe on the fact that he's not suicidal. But there's no reasoning with Joe at this point. He's made up his mind, and this fake Reese isn't changing it. He heads over to go free Marianne, but what he finds is extremely disturbing. Marianne appears to be dead. Now, the good thing from the dream was he was able to figure out a way into the cage. But when he does get in there, it's just too late. Marianne must have gotten over the allergic reaction, but the realization that she'll never be with her daughter again was too much, so she swallowed a bunch of pills. And it's coming at a really bad time, because her backup plan, Nadia, had gotten what she needed from Edward and was on her way over. In the season finale, it's tough for Joe, but he's got to get rid of Marianne's body. Normally, he would dump the body, but he knows that Juliet is going to want closure for her mother, so he just leaves her body on a park bench, and then he gets rid of the cage. The next day, he heads off to work, but the whole situation is really all I can think about. He's kind of just going through the motions in class, and that's when news breaks that Reese Montrose's body has been found. That gives him the opening to just end class early, because everybody's surprised by this news. But one person who didn't even show up for class was Nadia. She stayed away because she dove into who Joe Goldberg was. And when she Googles that name, everything that pops up, it's troubling, and it definitely is her professor. She ends up meeting up with Edward once he is released from class, and he's a little confused about their relationship. The way that she's been acting, he's worried that she was just kind of using him. And she apologizes, saying, no, that's not it at all. She's just really frazzled by everything that's going down. She actually really appreciates him in this moment. Because she feels like she's going crazy, and having Edward read exactly what she's reading regarding Joe Goldberg would do her some good, because then she would know that she's not crazy. Edward reads the articles that she found on the internet, and then she goes to show Edward the cage in the building, but it's gone, and she's shocked. She feels at that moment like she actually is going crazy, because she has no idea what happened to it. She starts frantically trying to explain to Edward everything that happened with Marianne and the cage and finding it, the key, everything. The only question that Edward has is, why didn't you involve the police? And she explains that if she involved the police, they would poke around and he would run. She needs him dead to rights. That's going to involve digging into this and trying to catch him. Some kind of evidence that connects Joe to Jonathan, to the murders, to everything. Joe, though, is currently getting ready to flee the city. One of the things he wants to do is write Juliet a note so that Juliet doesn't believe that her mom died a junkie. As he's doing this, his inner self reminds him, you are not suicidal. What his inner self is worried about is this recent report that Reese Montrose's body was found, because there's not much that they can't do to connect Joe to the body. So while Joe's concerned with Marianne and Juliet and just ending this cycle, his inner self is concerned about staying clear. Staying out of jail, not getting caught. As he's arguing with his inner self, he gets a text message from Kate asking him to come over, and he does that. He knows that this might be the last time he actually sees her, so he jumps at the opportunity. She tells Joe that she went to go visit Phoebe, and Phoebe was able to figure out what a leech Adam was, and when she gets better, she's going to leave town. Leave all that influencer lifestyle behind her. Start fresh. She then admits to him that she was planning on leaving town and cutting Joe off, because she realized that she had been falling a bit in love with him. That really scared her, because she's had trouble in the past with boys. When she was 18 and 19, she had boy problems because they would never stick around. She never could figure out why these guys were leaving, and then one day she overheard her father had hired somebody to follow her around. So she broke into his office, and she found a file regarding everything. Everything she did, everything she had done, and everybody who she had done. When she confronted him, he said, I'm your father, and the world isn't safe. I need to protect you. She then tells Joe about what her dad told her the previous day, about how he was involved in just about everything regarding her life. So to bring it back around, the reason why she was going to cut Joe off was because she was worried that Joe was sent there by her father, that he's not even real. And he assures her, Kate, I am very real. She starts crying in his arms, saying he owns me. And he just consoles her. He knows he has to do something regarding Tom, so once Kate goes to bed, he texts Tom from Kate's phone saying, "Let's meet at your airport hangar." And Tom is very quick to reply, "Yeah, sure, no problem." But Kate isn't heading there, Joe is. He knows that he'll be able to get Tom one-on-one. He sneaks in and tries to sneak up on him, but he's caught and he has to quickly come up with an excuse on why he's there. He stumbles over his words, but he starts asking Tom if it's going to be a problem that they found Reese's body because he figures that his DNA is all over it. And Tom assures him that it will not be a problem because he's got so many people in his pocket. The first chance he gets, though, when Tom turns around, Joe pounces, putting a chloroform rag over his face and then knocking him out. He ties Tom up, and now he's able to do whatever he wants with him. Now that Tom is tied up, Joe explains why he's doing what he's doing. Because ultimately, Tom Lockwood continues to hurt his daughter, and that's just something that Joe's not willing to let happen anymore. Tom tries really hard to get Joe to take a buyout, offering him just about anything he wants, but this isn't about money for Joe. It's about protecting Kate. The situation does get a little hairy, though, when Tom's security comes back from grabbing food, but Joe is able to kill him right then and there. And then he kills Tom. Having two bodies when he just expected to have one doesn't become an issue because now he has a murder-suicide on his hands. He ends up framing Hugo, the security guard, in the murder, saying that Hugo was blackmailing Tom for money. It went sideways. He ended up killing Tom and killing himself because he couldn't live with it. Because Joe has so much experience in this, he sets a very interesting crime scene where that is the only reasonable conclusion that one would have. It was just a really jealous, hard-on-his-luck security guard trying to extort money from his boss. After he does dump the bodies off in a location that can be found pretty easily, he heads to the closest bridge that next morning. And the whole time, his inner self is trying to convince him not to do what he's about to do, but Joe is dead set on ending this cycle for good. His inner self starts to get really desperate, trying to convince Joe that he's actually a good person. But Joe knows that this is only going to continue if he continues to live. He knows that he's just going to continue to kill, and it's never going to end. So he needs to take matters into his own hands. He says goodbye to this fake Reese, and then jumps in. But as soon as he hits the water, he immediately regrets his decision. Thoughts about everything that's transpired in his life come rushing into his head, and he has the will to live. And luckily, he does get that chance because somebody saves him, taking him to a hospital. He does wake up in this hospital, and he's pretty surprised to be alive, and that's when the doctor comes in and explains what happened to him. But when the doctor leaves, Kate comes in, because she had no idea that he was even suicidal. She's pretty pissed off at him for this suicidal attempt. But when she actually sees the state that Joe is in, she realizes just how severe this attempt was. It's clear to her now that the guy that she'd fallen in love with isn't as well put together as she thought. She knows that this guy doesn't need to be yelled at, he needs to be consoled in this moment. Joe tells Kate, "I didn't want to hurt you. But Kate, I've done terrible things. I've killed people." And he really fights with himself to even tell her this because he feels like he just got her back, and by telling her this news, it's going to push her away. But it actually doesn't. It's not like she gets turned on by it like Love Quinn did, but she's simply understanding because she remembers what happened with her life and how she killed people, although the circumstances were very different. Kate then switches the topic to her dad, telling Joe, he's dead. When the news came out, one of the people that was close to Tom and his company, Cynthia, told Kate about what Tom had Joe do by killing Reese. She's not saying it judgmentally, she just wants Joe to know that she knows the truth. But she also tells him that the tests were inconclusive, so they're never going to know who killed Reese. She doesn't blame Joe for this. She actually blames her dad for it, because the way she looks at it, my dad made you do it. Joe starts to argue with her because he doesn't want her to have to cover up his mess, but she cuts him off and says, "It's done. He's left me everything. I own the company now. I'm running it. I never would have thought of taking over the company, but you have made it possible to even conceive this type of future. That's all because you've gone and made me believe in myself." Because of what Joe did for her, she tries to repay the favor, telling Joe, "I know you're a good person." She then suggests that the two stay together because they can keep each other good. But in order to do that, she's going to need to know about his past. And Joe tells her, starting with the fact that his name isn't Jonathan Moore, it's Joe Goldberg. This will allow Kate to use her resources to make it clean for Joe to return to the United States. But as these two are discussing their future together, Nadia and Edward are trying to prove that this dude is a certified psychopath. While doing so, Nadia fills Edward in on her bold plan, the one that got Marianne free. That's right, Marianne isn't dead. Everything that happened was all calculated, right down to the text messages from the nanny. It was Nadia who changed the nanny's number to make it her phone number. So when Joe thought he was texting the nanny, he was actually texting Nadia. They set it up so that Marianne would look completely unhinged and a suicide attempt would be believable. But what Marianne actually took was something that Nadia gave her to slow her heart rate down. She knew that Joe wasn't going to bury her, so Nadia, waiting in the shadows, saw where Joe took her and then woke her up. Marianne was able then to sneak off and return to her daughter, and Joe Goldberg thought that she just died. It was genius, and Edward is completely amazed by it. But now they have to prove that Joe is, in fact, a killer. They head on over to Joe's apartment, and while Nadia is inside looking for evidence, Edward is outside keeping watch. It doesn't take too long for Nadia snooping around to find the box and find the evidence she needs, and she starts snapping photos. But when she leaves the building, Edward's nowhere to be found, and she heads to their meeting place, but still, Edward is nowhere to be found. He's not answering his phone. It's weird. And that's when Joe walks up on her. He's been discharged from the hospital, and he figured that something was going on with Nadia just by the way that she had been missing school and whatnot. So when he came home and he saw Edward standing outside, he knew something was going on, and he killed him. Nadia is so frightened that she's staring at this guy that she knows is a killer that she drops her phone and Joe picks it up, looking through the photos, casually deleting them, and then slowly backing Nadia up to the curb where she trips over Edward's dead body. Nadia is frozen still. She has no idea what to do. She's in shock. And Joe uses this to his advantage, taking the knife that he used to kill Edward out of his pocket and casually putting it in Nadia's hand. He explains to her that he's not going to hurt her, but what is going to happen is she's going to end up going to jail for a long time. He's also going to set it up so it's going to look like Edward was the killer of Reese Montrose, and thus he is going to get away scot-free. No one's ever going to believe Nadia, and nobody does. When the cops arrive, she's thrown in jail, and she never even spoke on her defense because she knew that no one would believe her. All she can think about is what Marianne told her, that Joe always wins. And in this case, it proved to be right again. Now that everything in London is tied up, Joe and Kate are able to fly to the United States and take over Tom's company. They're leaving behind a couple of friends. Blessing and Sophie bought Sundry House after Adam died. They took it over. It's a place that Roald routinely hangs out after he returned from Germany on a hunting trip. He shot a close personal friend during this trip, although using connections, everything stayed out of the papers. And Connie usually joins them at Sundry House because he only lasted 9 days in rehab, and he still does a lot of drugs. Phoebe, however, was the one that got away. She was true to her word. She tied up all her business in London and left to teach English to elementary school students in Thailand. She's off the grid, no longer an influencer, and loving life. She's the only one who doesn't suck. But now, Joe and Kate are a power couple in New York City running the company. Kate did use her resources, and now the narrative is that Joe was able to get away from a psychopath wife in Linda Madre. It's an incredible story, and it's gotten Joe a lot of support around the country. Because of the story, they do have to do some interviews, although they have a PR person steering the conversation away from the tough questions. During this interview, they kind of just give each other a bunch of credit for Kate running the company so flawlessly, and Kate giving Joe a lot of credit because he spontaneously bought a bookshop that was closing down, which he tells the reporter, it's just a passion of mine. But another person is also in this interview, and it's Joe's inner self, that fake Reese Montrose. He's still there. But this time, Joe thinks that he can keep him under control because he wants to do things for the greater good, like change the world for the better. He knows that in doing so, he might have to kill, but at least now he has a woman right next to him who is supportive of everything he does. And that is the end of Season 4. Thank you so much for getting this part of the recap. Please consider subscribing to the channel. Hit thumbs up if you liked it. Smash that thumbs down button if you thought it sucked. Make sure to share it on your social media platforms and be nice in the comment section because nasty comments make me feel bad. I have a Patreon, I have subscriptions, I have merch. Go buy a t-shirt or something, that'd be cool. But just know if you don't do all that, I do appreciate you listening.